So, welcome everyone to Race and the Color Line, the boundaries of Europeanness in Poland. Our speaker, Bolaji Balogun, is a sociologist based in the Department of Geography at the University of Sheffield in the UK. He holds the prestigious Leverhulme Trust ECR Fellowship and previously held the Leverhulme Trust Fellowship abroad at Krakow University of Economics in Poland. He's a member of the British Sociological Association and currently serves on the editorial boards of two prestigious journals, Sociology and the Sociological Review. His research focuses broadly on colonization, race, and racialization in Central and Eastern Europe, with a specific focus on Poland. Bolaji's academic publications have appeared in prestigious journals such as Ethnic and Racial Studies, the Sociological Review, and Ethnic and Migration Studies. His monograph, which you're just about to hear a bit about, will be out in fall 2023.
Thanks very much.
Welcome, Bolaji. We're happy to have you here.
Thanks. Thanks very much, everyone, for coming here this evening to come and really share I hope what will be interesting conversation. Special thank you to Mary with all the organization and the email front and back, how everything will plan out. So just forgive me for being a bit tired because I only just landed yesterday. But I'm very, very excited to be here today to be able to share what I've been really thinking about in the last 2 years, the ways in which we might think around race and colonization in Central and Eastern Europe with a specific focus on Poland, and how we might start thinking about the broad sense of thinking about colonization rather than reducing this thing to just Western Europe and America. So in the book itself is actually divided into two parts. The first part, which I try to locating Poland within the racialized boundaries of Europeanness. In this first part, what I try to do, which I'm going to set out later on in the talk, is just to show some sort of historical, sociological understanding of race beyond the West. And within that section, I came up with what I call three manifestations through which we could read race, racialization, and the racism in Central and Eastern Europe. So I looked at global colonial economy, colonization, and eugenics. And in the second part, I looked at, again, I call that living with experiences of race and racism. This second part is just based on empirical evidence, interviews and data that I collected with people of color when I was in Poland between 2018-19. Just to keep within time, we only focus, just for this talk, I'll focus on just the first part. But I'm more than happy to answer any question or just discuss broadly anything related to the second part. So what I'm seeking to do here is actually an historical sociology that's somehow different from the dominant accounts of colonization that we're often being told. And this particular historical question I'm going to be putting up shortly, it has to do with a lot of things in the past. And also, I started thinking about the ways in which those events will help us to understand, the present and the way in which we can even engage with the present. Again, a shift from the dominant account of race and racialization in the West. And in this talk, I think it is important to begin from what might seem familiar to many of us here, especially in the US. The first thing I'm going to be talking about, probably a lot of this more than I do. And then gradually, I'm going to take us to what might seem unfamiliar to many of us. And then I will try to link the ways in which the familiar is linked to the unfamiliar later on in my talk. I think a good place to start is actually 1492. Whenever I speak about 1492 as a year or a historical period, I get very, very excited. I get very nervous. It's a very, very interesting period of human history. And I think two events really shaped my thinking in 1492. First was the global colonization of the Americas under the sponsorship of the King and the Queen of Castile, Spain. And that's probably broadly well known. The second event that, again, shaped my thinking, again, also in 1492, was this Spanish idea of the Princess de Sangria, the purity of blood, that was used as a justification to exclude, in some cases, convert Jewish population and Muslim population into Catholicism in Andalusia, Spain. And I think these two events eventually went on to shape the ways in which colonies are established, especially here in the US, between 16th and 18th century, that actually led to the post-establishment of English settlers, the introduction of the House of Burgesses with the idea of divide and rule that eventually brought about a labor without freedom. Again, this is something that many of us in the room are actually familiar with the introduction of anti-miscegenation law in 1861. And in England, something we are very well aware of, the legacy of British slave ownership, which I found very, very interesting in thinking along many of these thoughts. And I found this very, very interesting. I mean, why that movement of people was actually going on between 16th and 18th century. The people that are actually moving from Europe at the time, we know that they came from different parts of Europe, Northern Europe, Western Europe. And these people, they actually, before 1691, these are actually a group of people that actually refer to their ethnic groups. So, call themselves English, Irish, Scottish, Portuguese, and in America. After 1691, this particular group, due to the anti-miscegenation law that was filed around this period, they started seeing themselves as white, which really in sort of way to cement the ways in which the non-white group was actually sort of eliminated or used in a different ways to develop America. And what we have, what all that led to, is the Black African labor in Native American lands. And I found this very, very helpful in thinking around how this particular short history of race and colonization is actually put in place elsewhere outside the dominant accounts in the West. And I think a very, very good way of linking what I said before about the familiar narratives into the unfamiliar is to think about racial contracts. This is another author I'm really, really excited about, Charles Mill. Whenever I think about racial contract, I get very excited, I get a butterfly. Sometimes I get emotional, about Charles Mill. It's amazing that it's no longer with us. Let me try. For anyone who is not familiar with the racial contract, let me quickly establish how compelling, I'll make that slide, but right, okay. Let me quickly establish how compelling is the argument that Mills offers in discussing the racial contract as a global phenomenon that underpins the boundary of Europeanness. According to Mills, the racial contract is an attempt to bring race and white supremacy into a dialogue with mainstream political theory. In doing so, Mill suggests that white supremacy is the unnamed political system that has made the modern world what it is today. In making this claim, he argues that the contract tradition is misleading because based on the concept of individuals who are seen as equal. This implies that the social contract tradition that Mills is talking about is not a contract between everybody, but an agreement between just people who count. That's the people who really are. Such agreement, Mills maintains, stems from contract between the white people with racial implications at its heart. In his theory, Mills uses colonization as a companion event for his analysis. He argues that colonization lies at the heart of the rise of Europe based on the exploitation of the non-European world underwritten by race. And central to Mills' argument is the American colonization, the colonization of the America between 1492 and 1830. The occupation of Africa, Asia, and the Pacific from 1730s up to the period of after the Second World War. This interlinked history, Mills maintains, are crucial to the understanding of race and racism because in both histories, race has served as a common conceptual denominator that gradually came to signify the global statuses of superiority and inferiority. Now, the understanding of the social contract that I've just briefly, set out so far has been centered on the United States and Western Europe. The concept has barely or perhaps never been considered in the theorization of race and racialization in Central and Eastern Europe. As I will use the term, or as I use the term in the book, the racial contract has to do with different ways in which power relations between white and non-white people are shaped by the representations and the historical actuality. So following Mills' logic, in the book, I deploy the term racial contract and the boundaries of Europeanness through the experiences of people who are often racialized socially and biologically as non-Europeans. The arrangement of the racial contract that I'm suggesting here is better understood in terms of global Europeanness and non-Europeanness conditions. These conditions are evident in the ways in which race is perceived in Central and Eastern Europe. They are empowered by the European Renaissance, the European Reformation, and the European overseas discovery. So the intended scope of my argument with this history is that the European expansion project brings into focus a white-dominated world from which less powerful European states have also benefited. Now, to illustrate all this, commendably, let me now turn to the ways in which the racial contract serves as a proxy for the boundaries of Europeanness through the three key manifestations that are set out in the first part of the book. So, economics, colonization, and eugenics, that they are often described in peripheral terms in national discourses in Central and Eastern Europe, in Poland in particular. But in my view, they carry very deep implications when it comes to race and racialization in the region. Drawing on Polish examples, I will identify close relationships between Central and Eastern Europe and the benefits of the global white supremacy, all based on attempt at national self-determination. So, the first manifestation I wish to draw your attention to is the global colonial economy. So where I focused on the other geography of the colonial global economy. Now, let me quickly tell you with this argument, I'm not equating Poland with European imperial powers or try to substitute Poland for France or Netherlands. While I'm very, very skeptical about the looseness of this connection, I equally consider the connectedness of Central and Eastern Europe to the transatlantic trade and necessary tax in order to show the broader implications of such trade beyond the Western paradigm. So my task here is only an attempt to put other European countries that have been thought of as detached, not complicit, irrelevant, on the radar of the Atlantic narratives. To unpick this entanglement, I want to pay attention to the web of Polish-Lithuania trade network, which I'm going to set out briefly in a bit, and then situate the network within the wider debates, of global debates on transatlantic trade. In doing so, again, I am signaling an argument here that colonial profits were not only integral to the development of the West, but also essential in the development of modern Poland. Now, before plunging into the details, I think it's very, very important to set out the configuration of the Lithuanian Commonwealth that I've been talking about, not just as we haven't been told, instead of like we received history in Poland, but as an empire and a very powerful economic house as well, that was very, very popular in Europe at the time. So the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in 1569 emerged as one of the largest and powerful territories in Europe and functioned from 1517 to 1795. By any account, the Commonwealth was a massive territory that consisted of two parts: the Korona, as in Polish, that means the crown lands of Polish people and Poland, and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Geographically, the Korona cover part of the old Kingdom of Poland and the entire Ukraine, just to give you the massive, big. In Polish, we call this period Czechoslovakia, that's the Fourth Polish Republic, how big this actually empire was. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania consisted of the modern-day Lithuania and Belarus. The massive geography of the Commonwealth presented its population beyond a single national framing, but as an empire. At the time of the Union, the Commonwealth was at the heart of European diplomacy, with French and Italian being spoken at the Polish courts. Exchanges between the Kingdom of England and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth were linked by trade and diplomacy that facilitated the presence of Polish missions in most European cities, such as Madrid, Vienna, and Rome. These eventually paved the way for what seemed to be the first Polish consular services that appeared in Copenhagen, in Vienna, and in Naples in 1630s. Indeed, the magnificent Poland-Lithuanian Union represented Poland as a powerful European empire. Now, this abbreviated account of this wonderful, amazing Commonwealth, in my thinking, make visible some neglected or important connection between the Commonwealth and Europe. Doing so, I think it's really set out some possible ways in which the Commonwealth's economy was tied to the economy of Western Europe. And that economy of Western Europe that was actually enhanced by the overseas discoveries and colonization. This is a particular area that many scholars in Central and Eastern Europe have pointed out, but in my view, they were never fully integrated into the broader dominant understanding of history of colonization. Now, here is the question that unsettles me, and perhaps it may unsettle you too. What was responsible for the economic success of Poland's golden age, the Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth? This particular question led, well, I don't have the very best answer for it, but it might be a point of entry. But this question led a Polish Jewish socioeconomics historian, Marian Maubist, to wonder, and I quote here, whether the colonial, industrial, and training expansion of Poland and England would have been possible at all without her strengthening of their contact with Eastern Europe. That's a question I was posed by Maoists? I cannot claim to have an answer to this, like I said before, but it would be a very good place to start. The period of great trade for the Baltic states under the Lithuanian Commonwealth has been recognized, as I said before, as Poland's golden age. Concurrently, it was also the peak of transatlantic slavery between 16th and 17th century, when the Baltic states entered a new rapid development trade with port in Antwerp and Amsterdam into the transatlantic trade. Until recently, many aspects of transatlantic trade have been reduced to the British, French, Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch creation of New World, including where we are today, America, with no attention given to small but significant trades that help to sustain the New World. To advance this argument, I draw attention to associated trades, such as the Lithuanian Commonwealth economy, that indirectly help to sustain transatlantic slavery. I think this is a very, very big, bold claim, but I'll try to do justice to it. So the significance of the European empire voyages have been well documented, as we all know. The voyages at the time have been said to be triangular, the movement of goods from Western Europe to Africa, from there, the movement of peoples to the Americas, and then the return to Europe with goods extracted from the colonies. What remains less known is how this European empire, for example, England, Spain, this was a small country with less resources. What remains unknown is how these people or these countries were able to meet the raw materials and resources required for the maritime exploration to dominate the world. Now, I get it, if the size of the United States wanted to dominate the world, right? But the size of England dominating the world, the size of Spain and the Netherlands, the Dutch, it's a small country, the Netherlands. And at one point in history, they were actually the dominating force in world trade. But the question we never ask is, where did resources that they used to dominate the other part of the world, where did those resources come from? That's the question I've been posing. The triangular trade did not exist in a vacuum, I argue in the book. It was largely supported by what Eric Williams describes as the associated trade in his majestic book, Capitalism and Slavery. Associated trade, I'll tell you what they are. They are material transactions supplied by established and less established European empires that help to improve the economic capacity of those empires. So the need for the production allows me to actually query the economic situation of Central and Eastern Europe, in particular the Lithuanian Commonwealth, at the peak of transatlantic slavery. A very, very important scholar who contributed greatly to this kind of work was somebody called John Wing. So John Wing draws an attention to this when he argues that between 16th and 17th century, the Baltic trade operated on a much larger scale than the extraction of timber in Asia and the Americas by the European empires. According to Maria Boguska and Norman Davis, who some of you might be aware of, Poland and the Baltics were at the heart of many trades that facilitated movement of goods and peoples across the globe, including divergence into colonial enterprises. The growth of the Dutch in the English trades, especially shipbuilding, the resources required for shipbuilding to colonize other parts of the world between 17th and 18th century has been attributed to raw materials, such as timber, iron, and tar from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Again, this led Maoists to argue, right, before I actually move on to the Maoists, so this is a document I actually came across when I was doing archival work in Gdansk. That's the I think it's National Maritime Center in Gdansk. It just roughly shows the trading routes during the period I'm talking about. And Poland, Lithuanian Commonwealth actually faded away. That's Poland, Lithuanian Commonwealth. And that's France. Of course, France has always been France and Spain, and the connection goes almost Africa and everywhere. So this again led my office to believe that the development of the Dutch and British shipping was unthinkable without a regular supply of East European timber. For example, places such as East Mazovia, a densely wooded area in Poland, supply timber to the West. Those products, according to my office, were considered essential in the Dutch and the British conquest and exploitation of the New World of overseas colonies. Also, according to James Davey, the raw materials used for some of the ships built in London at the time could only be procured from the Baltic region, which meant that the region took on a crucial strategic importance for policymakers in England and of course. Also, young Krzysztof Fedorovich, one of the leading Polish scholars, was actually based in Canada at the time, and James Farthing, a very leading historian, was actually based in York, in England, confirmed that there was a ferocious appetite for the Baltic and Northern European timber to fuel the expansion of the British commerce and the Royal Navy ships. Similarly, Spain's exploitation of the colonial forest in the early 18th century contributed to the Spanish naval revival, which aided its exploration of the Atlantic world and the imperial domination in the Americas. Although Spain exploited its local and colonial forests for the development of its navy, nonetheless, John Wings points out again that it was timber from the Baltic states that were on the whole better suited and highly sought after by all European powers, end of quotes. For example, according to Wing, the resources for the ships built in Cuba and Spain and Spanish colonies in the Caribbean came from the region, but many were also imported from the Baltic states. These eventually provided Spain with the second largest navy, just behind Britain. Also France, after 1766, turned to several other markets, including the Baltic timber, to increase its Atlantic shipyards. So this particular episode that I've been talking about of the Baltic trade was also supported by Norman Davies. When he presented this, I actually put this in some sort of graphic image that we can actually see properly. He actually puts it in text, in writing. And it's very, very interesting what historians, what they do. They write and they talk quite a lot, but without really drawing out some of the specifics and the implication of some of this stuff. But I think Norman Davies really did me a very good favor by bringing this up to show that the Baltic trade with the West involved exchanges of colonial and non-colonial materials shipping into Poland. So, for example, timber was the fourth largest product exported out of Gdansk in 1641. Over there, colonial products such as sugar and coffee were the second largest product imported into Gdansk in the same year. The export of Baltic raw materials such as iron, plants, and wood materials, they were mainly sent to Britain, France, and the Netherlands. Also, as the market confirms, the exporting and importing of raw materials such as wooden products and sugar contributed massively to the Commonwealth's economy as an associated trade to the imperial trade that we know. So this actually allowed Timaki to make the argument that with the rise of the Atlantic economy, the Baltic economy also developed. But the Baltic also provided nervous stores for the European states, which they eventually went to use in the colonization of many parts of the world. At the same time, France did not only often send domestic sugar to European markets. According to Williams, 2/3 of French exports to the Baltic states were colonial products such as sugar from Saint-Domingue. Right. Before closing on this section that I've just set out, let me briefly set out some of the benefits of associated trade that perhaps may help us to think about Cedric Robinson's racial capitalism, one that group actually done interesting work about, and really I need to think about, Cedric's argument, Cedric Robinson's argument beyond the West. Now, by trading with European colonial powers, Gdansk and other parts of the Baltic region were not only able to accumulate capital, but were also able to afford important colonial luxurious goods. So Arthur Hartman had a substantial argument to this when he links the early wealth of Central and Eastern Europe to the accumulation of bullion from the East India Company and the American silver from the Spanish and the Portuguese Empire, all through the Dutch East India Company as a payment for the Polish raw materials such as timber and iron. The Dutch East India Company, for anyone who knows the history of Poland very well, was further integrated into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth through migration of many Dutch people. Many of them moved into Poland, seeking political and religious protection. The introduction of these Dutch settlers to the region, Maria Boguska argues, came with the establishment of thousands of Dutch merchants, bankers, artisans, many various skilled specialists, and most importantly, the important modern introduction of modern banking system, credit operations, and technical innovations into places like that. Indeed, through trading, folks in the Polish ports such as Gdansk interacted with Western merchants on equal terms. The interaction involved what Maoists and Boguska have described as stream of money that found its way into Baltic region. This stream of money arguably improved the living standard of many Polish and Lithuanian nobles, while the serfs were being worked to death. According to Boguska, the accumulation of capital from transatlantic trades with Amsterdam, Cadiz, London, and Porto was one of the reasons why the East and people from Poland and the courts become very, very rich in the past. Through this stream of money from the sales of raw materials to the West, Baltic region was able to access the Middle and Far East trade, acquiring jewelries and expensive textiles. The accumulated wealth eventually led to the rise of Poland's golden age, the Renaissance Poland. So to this end, the building of the magnificent royal palaces, castle, and cathedral that we see in some part of Poland and Central and Eastern Europe, the acquisition of great architecture, sculpture, and paintings, the pensions provided to the Dutch, the Polish, and Italian builders and painters, as Maria Boguska broadly detailed, the whole range of cultural patronage exercised by the magnates and the gentry, as well as wealthiest townsmen. Part of the profit came from the trade with Western Europe. Now, I think it's very, very important to connect this to the migration that eventually happened from Central and Eastern Europe into the Americas. Through this notion of accumulation of wealth, I look at this geography as a kind of colonial geography, and the task of really connecting this colonial geography to Central and Eastern Europe is very, very important. And the reason for that is because of the number of people that actually eventually got migrated. Now, what we have here is one of some of the things I also uncovered at the Migration Museum in Gdynia. So this was a poster that was actually advertising for people that want to move from Central and Eastern Europe, mainly Poland, to the Americas. And this was what's actually put up at the time. And this was actually this, well, because the photo of the original of the ticket cover they actually used at the time. As probably you can see, these are the destinations they could actually go to in the America. And I think connecting this geography to colonial global economy is very much needed, you know, and beyond this, the wider connections, I think, brings into view several implications that shows the ways in which transatlantic slave trade and the creation of the New World form part of the larger economic enterprises that relied on the global networks of trade that have uprooted and relocated a lot of people from Central and Eastern Europe. And I think interlocked with this history, as part of the racial contract, I argue, was a massive transatlantic migration of unprecedented number of people from Eastern Europe to the New World. This included a large-scale migration of, you know, roughly over 2 million Polish people that moved to the Americas, and the subject of the Hungarian, Austrian, also they moved to the Americans. This colossal movement of Eastern European was actually pioneered by millions of white British Irish people settling in the colonies across the globe, including the Americas in the early 19th century. And I think this history of emigration, especially in the Polish case, may appear as individual or separate accounts, but I argue in the book that they cannot be understood as a separate category from that of the global colonial economy. And I think they are better understood as part of the racial contracts arrangements. Right, let me now turn to my second manifestation, which is colonization as part of the racial contracts through which Europeans ruled over Africa, Asia, Latin America. Now, to be clear here, I want to focus strictly on Poland's colonial-inspired activities before and after its attainment of statehood. So I'm talking about before and after 1918. So this close examination not only provides essential account of Poland's involvement in the European imperial projects, but also the implication, the local and global implication of such involvement. So to do this effectively, I follow a different critique of colonialism that beginning to emerge in Central and Eastern Europe. And in particular, I'm really interested in this woman. I love this woman very much, and Guminda Barbara. I rewrote Guminda Barbara's variety of European colonialism in order to unsettle the idea of colonialism that's often seen as one monolithic Western process. And I think it's really, really interesting the way in which Guminda really set out this notion of, varieties of European colonialism. And also it helps us to really rethink the notion of varieties of whiteness, in my view. And this, idea of European colonialism, which according to Gominda, it's actually happened looking at what individuals have actually done as well as collective bodies, in order to have a better understanding of what's actually going on. And for me to have a better understanding of this boundary of colonialism that I'm about to set out here, it is really important to begin with a nuance again, historical framing that places Polish individuals in what are called colonial orbits. Now, these individuals, they sought about navigating through some sort of hierarchical structure of the European nations. It's quite interesting the way Vladimir Fischer actually puts what these individuals, what they do, the way in which they see them, they perceive themselves as no individuals from Eastern Europe, as European, who are able to also use black servants, just like the Brits, the French, the Dutch would have done in places like Africa and also in Latin America. And I think that's really helping to think about some of these individuals that really operated within what I call the colonial orbits that we don't tend to see in the dominance accounts. And one of those was this guy called Stefan Szot-Rugodziski. Right, there is a now emerging documentation of Stefan Szot-Rugodziski's account of Africa, or exploration of Africa, between 1880 and 1883. It's a very, very good example of how whiteness and Europeanness cultivated by individuals in Central and Eastern Europe and the way in which they operate within the colonial orbits. So Rugodziski, this fellow here, was a Polish explorer who campaigned individually to raise funds for its exploration as an attempt to create a colony in Cameroon. Through Polish crowdfunding, Rugodziski successfully purchased the ship and sailed under Polish and French flags with German, French, and Polish ethnographers and engineers, all attached to German trading companies in Cameroon. Arriving in Cameroon, Rugodziski and his fellow explorers settled near a British administrative colony. Having gained the support and the trust of the local people, Rugodziski was commissioned by the British colonists to serve as an agent in Cameroon. While Rugodziski was doing all this, as an individual, at the back of his mind, he was also doing it in the name of Poland that was not existing at the time. Of course, there were Polish lands. There was no Poland, but Poland was never lost in the mind of the Polish people. Rugodziski's exploration may appear as Poland's first attempt at knowledge production about Africa, but the exploration needs to be understood within the broader framing. Let me show you some of the images that are covered by Rugodziski. So this was him actually on the ship crew in Cameroon. There was actually this gentleman that's actually, you'll see other images of him to establish this fellow. So this is Rugodziski with a crew that actually in Cameroon. And this is him with Swiss explorer in Cameroon in 1839. And I found this very, very interesting because there are so many interesting documentation about the Swiss exploration of Africa. None of these dominant accounts ever mentioned of any of other individuals of Central and Eastern Europe and what they were actually doing, what their contributions. Rugodziski's involvement with the Swiss, they're often called explorers, was actually seen as some sort of anthropological work that was actually sponsored. In fact, part of it was supposed to be funded by the Royal Society of Geography in Britain, but it didn't get the funding to actually do that. This was actually an image of Rubujiske. That's actually him again here in Calabar, Nigeria in 1885, and his fellow Polish explorer. And him here, and I found it very, very interesting. What Vladimir Walter said before, individuals from Central and Eastern Europe can easily imagine themselves into the whole broader European narrative and use Black servants as, as much as they like, and that's Rubujiske as an explorer. And again, this is another image of Rubujiske and his wife, Elena, in Equatorial Guinea, again in Africa, which is very, very interesting to see. And I think Rubujiske's exploration, I think this is where it becomes very, very interesting. For me, this exploration was only a rehearsal to what was to follow in the 1930s. And that's actually the work of collective bodies from Central and Eastern Europe operating again within the colonial, what I call the colonial orbits. And that's the body. The Liga Morskie i Kolonialne, that's in Polish, translates as the Maritime and Colonial League from 1925 to 1999. Now, contrary to the dominant account and the mainstream assumption that Poland was never involved in the European colonial projects, the Polish Colonial League spent a large part of the 19th century lobbying for colonial acquisition. For example, Poland actively sought and successfully engaged in trades for purposes of products, including raw materials. This was actually in the 30s. It was not a surprise to see Poland's demanding for area of settlements outside Europe. Through such demands, Polish professionals and elites, despite their victims of, of being traumatized by the partitioning during the old division of Poland into three, they still try to develop their own what Lenny Barreiro described as colonial fantasy, in order to establish colony in Africa and in Latin America. Now, this aspect of colonization, I argue in the book that it remains an area where most purists of capitalism actually they failed to really recognize as part of the global development that was fundamentally dependent upon colonial exploitation. Poland's colonial invasion may appear as fantasy to many, but involvement in the pan-European colonial project, according to Valerio, present Polish elites with the imagination of catching up with the imperial powers. Now, there were some other interesting stuff. So this is one of the statements from a member of the Polish Colonial Society. This was one of the actually with their demand to have a colony and trying to compare the need for the colony with what is been achieved in the West. And in all fairness, I get it, because when you have about 5 neighbors and they are doing relatively well and you are sort of like, finding hard to get by, you'll be asking questions. How are these people getting by? And then you found out that they managed to establish a factory somewhere else, without any problem. And then, well, you know what, I could easily blend it, and own the factory as well. And this was actually basically what Poland was actually trying to do. What is particularly interesting, the documentation of the activities of the Polish Colonial League is the fact that this is just an infringed organization. It wasn't really popular, nothing really came out of it. But I argue differently from also some of the images that I uncovered, which I'm going to be showing you, that the purpose of the Polish Colonial League was mainly, first, to reveal sea and maritime exploration as Poland's national instrument. But that quickly transformed into the League of Polish Navigation and later adopted its official name, Liga Moscow e Coloniale, that's Maritime and Colonial League in the 1930s. Now, there are several steps that they took in doing some of this. First was the establishment of the monthly magazine. They have a magazine called Poland at Sea. I think that's one of the ones I already showed here. This are actually some of the publications of the Polish Colonial League in the 1930s. That's quite telling, really. If you look at some of them, there are indications of somewhere tropical, but I don't want to say Africa, but obviously somewhere tropical you can see, and they are also in Polish, the interest with the sea. And once that was actually established, that was quickly followed by the establishment of the Polish Colonial Society with membership reaching up to 500,000 individuals, over 1,000 units throughout Poland, including 1,000 schools, societies, making it one of Poland's largest organizations in the 1930s. In addition to that, the Friends of Polish Sea was established in Australia, in Austria as well, Canada, France, Germany, and also here in the United States. We need to remember they are lobbying the League of Nations for colony, so they have to establish all these small areas across the world. And now to enhance their activities outside Europe, the Polish Colonial League purchased several lands in Brazil and also acquired some plantations in Liberia, which I will show you in a bit, in order to enhance the economy of Poland. Now, there have been suggestions that this initiative about Poland trying to have a colony would also lead to Poland being able to recruit some soldiers from Africa whenever there's any need to defend Poland. This was the time that, this was before the Second World War, by the way, but they knew that they were living next to very, very powerful neighbors. So being able to establish that contact elsewhere, like Africa, they can easily recruit people, which eventually happened, especially to the UK, where they, and France, where they recruited so many soldiers from Africa and North Africa, right, which we don't get to hear their names about recently. So Poland sort of like talked about a similar thing from the start, but very much more than that. The moves partly meant that to prepare Poland for the desired position of one of the European colonial empire dominating Africa and its resources. And also giving this widespread, Polish maritime influence, it wasn't too long before the organization started to make a nationwide campaign to popularize the idea of colony across Poland, and its main target, of course, was actually Africa, following the step of Portugal, Spain, Britain, France, Germany, and Italy. Although the Polish Colonial League spread special interest in colonizing Togo and Cameroon, the organization also hoped to obtain some of the former German colonies in Africa. However, the closest to the realization of colonial aspiration was in Angola. Angola was actually considered as a possible space where some Polish settlements could actually find a place to stay, which I think probably the thing will really allow Polish people to establish themselves as farmers, and they can extract the material that's actually needed back into the metropole in Warsaw. So this was an image in 19 1938. For anyone who can understand a little bit of Polish, you can read that poster where it's actually written. There's a strong demand for colonies for Poland by the Liga in 1938 protests in Katowice, that's South Poland. Also, this was in Krakow in 1938, the same. Excuse me. That truck, the Polish word in that truck, I couldn't read that, only if anyone could. But what that translates as is colonies are the prosperity of Poland. Again, the League had demanded during their protest. And by the way,
this demanding it of? Who are they demanding it of?
Right, to the League of Nations, to also their government, asking, pushing the government to actually push the international organization to open up their economy. Remember that statement that I showed you before about a member of the League asking that the same route be open to Poland to own colony, just like Italy, just like any other place. But I think it was 1930, 1938, there was a day, they call it a colonial day in Poland. And there was this protest, sort of march around the country, demanding, as you will see in other images that I'm going to be showing. So it was some sort of propaganda and images to push the state to move towards the idea of colony. So there is another protest. The strength, again, the strength of Poland lies in the colony. The leader, I believe, this, for me, I don't know about you, but this is not an enriched organization. It's a crowd of Polish people, supporting them all, and that's their members asking for, for colony. It's almost like, well, we need to get something cheap stuff from wherever it is in order to make our country better. And I think this really sort of encouraged me to think also about the wealth production in England, because quite a lot of argument has been made about how did England become rich, and when you speak to white people about it, it's always about invention in the industrial revolution. But before the industrial revolution, where did the wealth come from? Of course, we cannot claim that the entire wealth has come from the colony, but we need to admit that part of the money came from outside Europe somewhere, and that continued to be reinvested. In fact, I don't want to digress too much, but most of our banks, probably you might know it today. If you can mention any banks in England today, before they became banks, they are insurance companies where enslaved people were actually insured, and also ships were actually insured. It was after the end of enslaving the people when I believe reparation was paid to them, not to people that actually decided to pay for. The money was actually reinvested into what we now call banking today. So every time when I go into my bank, Lloyd's or Barclays, okay, yeah, we know where your money comes from, but just do what we're asking you to do, please. But this is the kind of history that is not actually known to many. But in a similar style, this group in Poland was actually trying to create the same thing. I'll just move on quickly because of time, very conscious of time. This is very, very telling. The banner, this was in Krakow, yes. And again, that banner reads, Africa is reservoir of natural resources. Again, naming it where it should be. So that's it. But again, anyone who can understand a little bit of Polish can easily translate that. There's another interesting one for me. There's a group of Polish women, just many women organizations. The colony can solve the problem of employment. Demanding for Poland to have colony. And last one is again this demand of this banner actually that demand for Polish colony. It was 1938. So I come back to my argument that in all of this colonial history of the development of capitalism, I argue, requires an active consideration beyond the West. The European colonial order may appear as Western projects, but as Bernard Hersey argues, it was unified racially and works through racial order that rests on the differences between Europeanness and non-Europeanness. Indeed, I want to suggest that many aspects of Poland's attempts at colonization need to be understood as part of the larger processes of Europeanization that cannot be reduced to any particular geography in Europe. I don't want to bore you too much, and I'll quickly now move to my final manifestation, which is eugenics. This might be something that probably not very familiar, especially, of course, eugenics is something we quite talk about, especially in the West, very big in the US, probably in North America, really. But in Central and Eastern Europe, eugenics is probably still, I cannot even say it's emerging, because not enough work has actually been done on this. And I think it's worthwhile, for the argument I make in the book, to just pause briefly over the origins and the uses of eugenics in Poland. Why? We still need to keep in mind the origins and their broader implication and their circulation across Europe. So, doing so will enable a better understanding of race in a place such as Poland that has been assumed to be detached from the global concepts of race. Now, the origins of eugenics in Poland cannot be fully understood, I argue, without two significant events, that shaped them: the partitioning of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the distressing effects of the post-World War. This meant that the Polish state thinkers had two important issues to grapple with in 1918 when Poland came back to become a country. First was the very, interesting, important way to fight, diseases and illness that plagued Polish lands just after the First World War. And the second, this is the most important and interesting aspect, because eugenics was not really clear to people what exactly eugenics was doing in Central and Eastern and in many places as well. The second was the formation of the new Polish states. After the partition, Poland came to become a state again. Eugenics, I argue, including that the prevention of illnesses, remain important in the national history of Poland because it offers the Polish state thinkers two-headed sword. One is to eliminate the illness. The second was actually, it's sort of like help them to really decide who really is Polish. So eugenics relies on the blood formation, testing of blood, to actually say, what, this blood actually is original Polish blood. And in that case, anyone who doesn't have that blood formation is sort of like excluded. So it's not, in this sense, not written on the skin, it's actually within the blood of individuals. So this account of eugenics, we need to understand, was not limited to Poland as a way of, developing a state, the process of nation formation. Remember, most nations actually in Central and Eastern Europe only came back to be independent after 1918, after the First World War. And this notion of eugenics was actually fully established across the region. So the establishment of eugenic society in Central and Eastern Europe actually occurred as early as 1914 with Hungarian and Czech, organizing public debates and attending international conferences on eugenics. However, eugenics did not gain major traction in the region until after the First World War, when independent states like Poland and all that began to harness both the democratic circulation and embrace the scientific elite to pursue eugenic and biological agendas. Their aim was to preserve the original quality of those, what they say as quality of those nations, to strengthen their ethnic defense and to instill eugenic responsibility for the future generations. Now, this development was evident across, like I said, the region, and it was actually considered as part of the processes of nation formation after 1918, but it's often a shift between national discourse and science of, improvement as the way of, when we have to progress through technology. For example, eugenics in Russia was not just an intellectual exercise. I argue in the book that as part of the process of nation formation in the 1920s, eugenics was aimed at specific composition of the Russian nation and race in Russia. Also, the construction of Belarusian nation was based on eugenic activities already established in Germany and Soviet Russia. Similar examples could be found in sterilization programs in the Czech Republic. In Ukraine, racial configuration was modeled on eugenic ideology. In Bulgaria, the ultimate aim of eugenics program was to engineer a new national identity through an endorsement of what is often perceived as the ideal Bulgarian race. Also in Hungary, it was a popular belief that eugenics will add to the social transformation of the Hungarian nation. Similar cases could be found in Romania, where eugenic sterilization program was geared towards the political engineering of the biologically defined community. Also, Estonian Eugenic Society embraced several processes of racialization as a way of producing the core, what is often pursued as the core Estonian type. In Latvia, eugenics contributed to the idea that Latvians belong to the supreme European race through a link to the so-called Aryan race. In Lithuania, eugenics favored the introduction of genetic counseling. In Poland, however, which is the area that I'm very interested in, similar to the nations in Central and Eastern Europe, the historicity of eugenics is still rarely discussed, yet considered essential in national self-determination. The emergence of modern Poland in 1918 came with the establishment of many organizations that were considered progressive during the partition Poland. For example, the appearance of the Polish Eugenic Society in 1922 formed part of the modernizing process for eugenics movement across Europe and also in America. It was considered a necessary part of processes of aligning the newly established Polish states with progressive states and sciences. So to this end, Polish doctors contributed to the development of eugenics through several international collaborations outside Central and Eastern Europe. Although race was argued at the time that it was less important to the Polish members of the Polish society, but I said in the book that it was through the hidden futures of eugenics that one comes to grasp its connection to the improvement of civilization, culture, and impurity. I mentioned before the notion of imperial desangria, the notion of the bloodline. This is where it actually become very obvious in nation formation, Central and Eastern Europe. As Madam Nagaldin explains, these eventually manifested into the exclusion of not only inferior individuals, but prevention of race mixing. Indeed, the echoes of biological racism are very, very telling here. The adoption and adaptation of biological racism are not completely fraud of eugenics programs that have been manifested in the argument presented by members of the Polish Society, Polish Eugenic Society in the 1930s. So, for example, in Poland, it was not uncommon for members of the Polish Eugenic Society to describe the introduction of the Polish Jews into Poland as an alien racial characteristics. Now, one major example, one notable example of that was actually before I spoke about Karol Stoyanowski. So this actually was an image of, this was a propaganda poster that was actually released in the 30s about the establishment of eugenic society across Poland as probably into the Lviv, where it's now Ukraine, before actually it became Ukraine. So you can see it's actually in the north, west, south, and everywhere. And these actually are the members of Eugenics Society in Krakow. Right. One notable example of member of the Polish Eugenics Society was Karol Stoyanowski, was a Polish anthropologist and eugenicist who believed, quoting in his own view, eugenics is a science and a movement concerned exclusively with the interests of the nation as a whole. So that already gives us some sort of understanding the ways in which eugenics is actually used to actually produce what is assumed to be the national type. This understanding of eugenics, in practical terms, pursue the ultimate assessment of nation's eugenic type. In doing so, it sought practical ways of national expansion, improvement, and advancement. However, these goals were not without processes of elimination that followed racial lines. And a major consequence for that matter has been the eugenic policies that must be discharged racially in order to produce valuable Polish types, as Stepanowski put it in the case of the Jewish question. It says in here. Now, what he's trying to actually do here really is in the process of now Poland has to join one of the leading, the ranks of great nations. Stepanowski believed that it would be highly desirable to Polonize German elements in Poland because it's actually seen, the Germans are actually seen as valuable type, and also the assimilation of Russian type or the repolonization of previously racialized Poles. He argued that this should be encouraged. However, the assimilation of Polish Jews, Stepanowski argued, there's no option for that, but a complete elimination in order to prevent what he described as the introduction of the alien characteristics into the Polish society. Right, with this circulated point of view about the Polish Jews, it was only a matter of time before eugenics started shifting from intellectual disciplines to national discourse in order to address the problem of impurity. Symbolic in this respect was Poland's attempt to achieve a near perfect nation formation as that is unmixed, undiluted, and one that is pure. So to do this effectively, the Polish eugenicists, similar to their Western peers, were attracted to the idea of blood type. Phrenological and body measurement are based on biological determination. Right, to close on this section, the point that needs to be established here is that within this example of selective breeding across the nations in Central and Eastern Europe, race and racialization became infused in the deep cultural concern about the appropriateness of certain mixture between different types of human beings. This picture, this really obsession with body, I argue in the book, is something that we really need to think about beyond the widely established idea of eugenics in the US and in the Western Europe. Just quickly on the concluding thoughts, before we move into discussion. I want to, in the book, I actually concluded with racial contract logic in mind, that the arguments that are set out in this, especially those free manifestations, the colonial global economy, colonization, and eugenics, they really help me to think around, the racialized economy that cannot be cannot be really a single objective of just powerful, European states, but financial exchanges from which the less powerful European states have also benefited. So what is particularly interesting is the assumption that all European states share a race, often coded as white, Christian, European. Such a link has a cumulative effect on the people racialized as non-European, most especially non-white. To be clear, the concept of the racial contract that I have signaled here relies on blood relations defined strictly by race, presented through promedial attachments. The purpose of such attachments, I argue in the book, is partly to make the boundaries of Europeanness visible to outsiders in order to acknowledge the existence of the dominant group. It is, indeed, I argue further that it's a marking of a sense of one's place in the social contract, and also an indication of a sense of the place of others in the racial contract. I'll finish there. Thank you very much.
We can have the moderate ourselves, but if you guys get in trouble with each other, David.
Yeah, I wonder, you have a lot of interesting facts here, and I wonder what like the Liga, Morska, and you showed all of these giant rallies, and you said, they had 500,000 members, I think you said, right? And 1,000 school organizations. I wonder if, do you know anything about what that social movement looked like? Was it explicitly racist? Did it present itself that way? Did they have any Africans from the region, one or two, saying, we want a Polish colonizer? Did they try to find something like that? Because that'll give us a sense of, Polish racism, which at this time in the 1930s, as you point out, Polish racism is focused on Jews, right? And so, right, that's the other thing. The Africans presented differently than that. So, just give some sense if you can, I don't know if there's material on that, on what that society, what the ranks of the movement was in relation to Africa and African.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. I think that's a very, very interesting question. Remember that section I say in there, it's about colonization. It's one of the three manifestations. So I just only based it on attempts to have a colony outside Europe. And there were so many things that are actually done to actually achieve that. I think what the Colonial League, what they were looking to do, they were not if we probably think about what they were doing at the time, not exactly, they don't really see it in terms of race. So that's why I frame that as a colonial attempt for it's not too much to actually think about what eventually happened if Poland eventually have, say, for example, they plan to have Togo, they plan to have Cameroon, they plan to have Liberia. When they say they go on to actually have these places as colony, it's exactly almost the step that been taken by Spain, by France, by Portugal. The process of colonization eventually did not end in just bringing resources and wealth from the colony into the metropole. The process is also the elimination of people that are probably perceived as inferior. Now, for them, they are looking at how do we develop our country by bringing in resources that has never been accessible to us from elsewhere, mainly tropical countries. The places that will probably be easily accessible to us will be countries in Africa. In terms of race, it wasn't explicitly actually stated how, but one thing I actually uncovered was just some of the programs that actually members of the Polish Colonial Society set out was a handbook that they will use to control the colony. Many of these ideas in these handbooks, actually, they are really very, very clearly that there's a sense in which somebody feels that is actually superior to the people that actually will be working on the farm. So one of the ideas was actually to reintroduce Christianity into this, for example, Liberia, that they will actually be colonized. There is a document online which I don't know if we have access to the internet here. I can easily show you part of the document that they actually set up. There's a magazine. This magazine is actually called Mujunek. I don't know if anyone will understand Polish, but it's a very controversial word. It's been translated as Black. It's been translated as Mujun. You need to see the cover of Mujunek to really understand what may eventually happen. But importantly, the idea behind the Polish colonial society was really to have resources. As probably you've seen in those in the matches, they really wanted to have, what we could simply call wealth that they could actually move into, into the metropole. It's, in my view, not very much different from what we've seen in the West. And I struggle to see how Poland would do it, differently. Even if they try to do it differently, because of what has already been established by countries like Britain, France, in those places that Poland was trying to colonize, we most likely to experience a similar things. And eventually, the notion of race will probably come out better. I think for me, with this argument, it's probably irrelevant whether Poland eventually, whether these adventure activities or attempts, whether it happened or not, for me, it's a secondary argument. But the idea that you have to follow in the step of the West to have a colony in order to have a better, country, it raises a lot of questions. I hope that probably answer your question. Yeah, but the notion of race, it was never really, was not in the forefront. And also we need to remember, when Columbus came to the Americas, he was not aware of race. It was through the processes of colonization that the notion of race started to emerge, and they used that idea to actually eliminate people that are actually seen as, inferior. So, yeah.
Hi. Yeah, thanks a lot for the talk. It's very, very stimulating. And I came a bit late, so I'm a bit hesitant. Since I missed the beginning of the talk, so I hope I will make sense. I appreciate this kind of a globally interconnected view of colonialism and Eastern Europe too, like this intervention of actually placing Eastern Europe that time space to the colonial global economy, imperialism, and so on. But I also kept wondering how this colonial relations, transatlantic colonial relations, and as you described, with all these exchanges, on unequal terms, this uneven development of the world, if you will, like it transform also the social relations and divisions within these lands we call Eastern Europe. Like the, this golden age story is a story of the gentry, right? After all, I mean, then you have then the laborers or peasants, like all, it's not really, so, yeah, I mean, right? I mean, this also like Malovists, and then we told Pulas, and like all this contributed to this, world capitalist, economy, this analytic. So they were struggling with those kind of like questions, right? The grain trades and like all that. So like, could you say a bit more about these kind of, like how it also, like it transforms, like the relations, the division.
It means transformation of what might be colony at the time. Of course, there's going to be transformation. So it depends on what sort of transformation we're talking about here. The positive, it's negative. And again, the fact that this thing did not really come to pass is very, very difficult to actually, start imagining what it would look like. But we have prototype. Again, I cannot say Poland going too far from what other leading colonial states have already done. In fact, there are documents that actually, really, historians actually pointed this out very clearly, that the idea of having a colony for Poland, for example, in Liberia, was, I think you mentioned this before, was sort of exchanges rather than, a proper colony like in the West. There was an attempt to move away, from the West. But in the documents that I've seen, there was never any attempt to actually have developments of those places. I think one person who would probably try to cover that aspect was Valerio Cabral in Colonial Fantasy, when the Polish people moved to Argentina and Brazil, that they tried to actually develop the land. But the land that they gave them to develop was far away from well-developed areas. So they mainly like really forests, that they have to really develop from the start. What came out from that was actually nothing really substantial. So it's, again, very difficult for me to actually say, this is what it would look like, because there was actually no evidence of that, places they refer to as colony being developed. I think it was more about the metropole. How can the metropole develop? I think I came across some of the documentation that they would try to invite representatives of countries like, say, Liberia into Poland. Whether that was actualized or not, that was probably, again, another thing, but definitely there was no. But we could imagine that there will be transformation, obviously.
Can I have a kind of quick follow-up?
Of course, yeah.
I mean, a different question now, but like in a similar spirit,
Yeah.
if you will. I mean, this colonial imagination, the Ligomorska that you talk about, the colonial league, for instance, like what does it do within the, this unequal relations, the social relations, like within, for instance, this newly established nation state, right? What is location, like how does this colonial imagination work through, for instance, class relations or like other divisions of labor, like inside the Eastern Europe, like inside Poland, right? This is also the radical nationalism movement and so on and so forth, and then the colonial connection over there. So like, how do they actually work together?
Right. Okay. That's a very, very interesting question. I think again, the period that the colonial league actually came to the forefront was the period when Poland tried to establish its power, and to show that part of the process of being a powerful nation is again to actually have, a colony. Within Poland itself, of course, it was actually restricted to people with with powers. In fact, most members of the Polish Colonial League, they're actually famous names in the Polish politics, and actually former Polish generals. So it's really been really sink down to the Polish society. Nonetheless, as probably you've seen in those images that I showed you, they were trying to galvanize a lot of people from the Polish society to actually be members of the Polish Colonial League. That it was actually assumed that it would transform Poland in some sense. And we see those images, they are not actually carried by, leading members of the Polish society. There are people from, local community, ordinary common people. I think one way of thinking about it is the understanding of having a colony at the time. Probably, I think differently about having a colony. And at the time, it didn't occur to these people as a system of extraction that would lead into a very difficult relationship with the people or with the place that they assumed as a colony. Never really occurred to them in that way. They look at it as sort of exchanges between them and that nation. But what would be in return was actually never mentioned. And in one way or the other, it was actually used to sort of an attempt to put Poland's name also on the map. Because if you want to be, a leading member of, European society, you look at what's actually been done in the past. Probably you try to do the same thing. But nationally, it has its own effects, but of course not as much as it does in Western Europe. I think one thing. Sorry. Oh no. I think one thing that I don't want to say this is a shame, was that it didn't really happen for us to know the effect, and it would be unfair to start second guess. Say, okay, this is what they did, or this is what it was going to lead to. But the idea was actually it was there, and there were attempts that they made to make this happen. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. As my colleagues have said, for a really stimulating talk. I have about 1,000 questions. I'll try to ask only one because it's late. Maybe just picking up from this part of our discussion and thinking, for example, about the proposal that came from certain people who could make proposals. So I'm going to call them elites, but I don't know how elite they were in Poland, to develop some kind of relationship with land in Liberia. So considering that Liberia was already a colony, right? And there have been all of this displacement of, let's say, indigenous people in Liberia in favor of African Americans who migrated there. So one imagines that in the Liberian case, the people who might be at all interested would be those elites who have all kinds of contradictions bubbling around them all the time to this day. And so I think I'm asking your question again. So in the context of Poland, which elites? You mentioned generals. So is it people who came up through the military? Was it the small or the large bourgeoisie? Was it the gentry who had fallen on hard times, who were trying to reclaim their position? Was it people from the bottom saying, at last we cannot be at the bottom because now we can be Polish and therefore rise to the top? I mean, who are the who's? And let me just say one more thing. I know you've already done all your research and I haven't read your book yet because it's not published yet, but are there any indications in, say, in popular culture, like what we call dime novels or movies or anything like that, to show like what the fantasy was on the ground, in this period?
Thanks very much for that. Let me take the second question first.
Okay.
I think I was speaking to Nicholas about this before we all gathered together. My first publication was actually based on this colonial fantasy. And the idea came from that thing that you mentioned in any popular culture. So there was a documentary on the History Channel, the Polish History Channel, about the ways in which Poland attempted to actually have a colony. It was completely in Polish. You could probably Google it. It's probably be on YouTube now. But this documentary was never really taken seriously. It was also the discussion in the documentary was just, very dismissive about the action of the Polish colonial society, because at the time when the documentary was actually made, there was not enough material available or probably looked at the time. So, for example, in the documentary, they actually showed the ways in which they got several ships and sailing into Africa. They showed some of the Polish people that are actually involved in sort of like negotiation of lands to have. They didn't probably call it a colony. They call it some sort of exchange. But the society that's actually responsible for the organization of many of these things actually call themselves a Polish colonial society. Again, I assume this idea came from the already established colonial organizations in the West. And they didn't act alone because they're acting based on what's been done previously in the West. So yeah, in terms of popular culture documentaries, I think that documentary was the only one that I think is available. I haven't seen any movies or anything else about it. In terms of the people really responsible, there were not a lot of really, like I said, in terms of this question, but there are not a lot of really people from, say, local people actually voicing these things apart from that protest, standing out, this protest. In terms of people that are actually in front of these things, there are mainly people that have actually served in the Polish Navy previously. They understand this idea of the sea very, very well. And the development of the Polish Colonial League actually came from sea exploration. So it wasn't really originally a colonial idea, but the fact that they really wanted to just explore the sea really eventually turned into, what, we can actually go further than we thought. And one way of actually doing this was to establish an organization to make ourselves, just so we're actually serious about this. So in terms of the group of people, of course, there are just one or two politicians, Devsky, the one that I actually mentioned before, and then, but mainly the people in the Polish colonial organization, they are the people that are actually their navies. They've actually served in the Polish seas. So it wasn't. I think what they were actually trying to, they realized that there was not enough momentum to actually do this start with. That was why they changed the name. They changed the name about 3 times in order to actually get people. And again, because they were not very big or powerful enough, that was why they came up with that Colonial Day that was actually celebrated in the 1930s, 1938, in order to get people to actually join join the organization in order to put forward an argument for colony, that this is not just something that just one small organization is asking for. There is, in fact, there is a picture, I don't have it here, that actually says over 1.5 million people are behind us. There was an image. I promise I can get that image and send it to you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for this really, really incredibly interesting talk, and also such an interesting archival material that you have found and presented to us. And so I have a question about that, because you had a lot of your materials are from like the late 1920s and to the late 1930s. And I was wondering if you have found in your archival work, if you have found any links, or what are the links between like the kind of the colonial league in Poland and let's say, the rise and the spread of fascism in the region during that time. And so I was just kind of wondering about that because, you know, like these ideas about ethnic supremacy and eugenics and, you know, all of that. And what were, like, how were these kind of political movements sort of interlinked, or how were they enabled by the rise of you know, the fascism during the time? I mean, it's a very troubled.
It is.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll take Neva's question too, just so that you have more to work with, since we're getting kind of late.
Yeah, I guess it can maybe even build up on what Jirka just asked. Thank you very much for this talk. I was wondering about how this history is like, is it discussed in any way, or like how does it figure in the present in Poland today? Because like, I don't know, and it's also like, was it reappraised and criticized during socialist times? Because I guess there is like a different legacy in terms of like links between ex-socialist and states, and
that's a very interesting one. Do you mind if I take that question first?
Yeah.
Yeah, again, but I mean, myself and April, we have this conversation before. The straight answer to your question is no. It's probably hardly been discussed. And the reason for that is because of the kind of the present Polish state, the government in Poland, peace, it seems that the history of Poland only started in just after 1918 and ended in just after 1945. Anything that happened before that is almost as if there was no Poland, you know. And the history that's often presented on the TV, especially if you watch the state-controlled TVP, it's really the glorification of Poland without, I've never even come across this attempt at having a colony in Africa or Latin America. Even that documentary that I mentioned before was actually on History Channel. That's what it showed maybe actually in the 80s. So in the present, there's actually probably not a lot being said about, being done, or even tried to link it into contemporary events. But what is particularly interesting, which really get me excited, is about newly emerging Polish historians and young historians. They've actually, some of them actually studied in the US history. They've now started really reshaping these ideas. Probably you will see some of their work in the book when it was published. They've started really talking a lot about this thing, but I could probably in my work I've only cited just two, you know. So the problem mainly is not only the problem with the state, but also the history or the understanding of history, or what the Polish historians doing in Poland. Because most of my work, or the works I cited or I rely on, they are mainly they are Polish historians that actually work outside Poland. Not really on any influence to really follow the state line. So that is why it's a bit difficult to produce that kind of thing. But definitely watch the space in the next 5 years. That's really quite interesting stuff actually happening. Coming back to the question, thanks for that opportunity to change around. Right. I think I didn't look at, part of the book I looked at, of course, fascism was actually taken on almost everywhere, and Poland was actually included. But I decided to not get involved with that because it will be a reproduction of what we already know, you know, and this idea of also the ways in which fascism is being used in East and also in other parts of Eastern Europe. I have the feeling that they often really sealed off really interesting stuff that we need to really unpack and unroot and bring to the fore. So in the discussion about with the Liga, they probably not mentioned anything about, you know, nationalism, not even mentioned, or fascism, not even mentioned. But what I found interesting is the fattest Polish politicians or the members of Polish colonial league. What they were trying to do was actually to bring Poland to the fore. So, and I suppose it won't probably be sellable for the League to start bringing up, the notion of fascism when they are trying to appeal to the League of Nations to allow them to have a colony. So it didn't really occur at all. Research this point in that way, but but more than that, it's always done in the name of, in the name of Poland.
I have, I guess it's more of a comment, but maybe it's a question, or we'll make it into a question. So I've also been wondering with others, kind of what are the working classes, how are they involved in this, right? And how can we tell the differences amongst groups in society in terms of who was actively involved with this, and then maybe potentially how others might be invited into these ideas. But one of the things that strikes me when you talk about achieving colonies as part of progressing into, the ranks of nation states, is that, and you Polish studies people will have to correct me if I'm wrong, but certainly in Hungary, in the 1800s, you have an argument that Hungary is a colony of Austria. And I'm thinking about partitions Poland, right? And I'm assuming that in partitions Poland, there are arguments that they're colonized by Russia, by Austria. And so there's a kind of, we achieved our way out of being colonies ourselves, and now we will colonize. And certainly in Hungary, those we are being colonized arguments were being, again, made by the gentry. And they were part of a kind of project, again, to become nation states. So again, I know it's more of a comment than a question, but I maybe you can reflect on it.
Absolutely, I can speak to that. No, but again, the idea of or the attempt to have a colony did not just occur suddenly. It was based on the experience. I was saying to somebody before that when Poland was partitioned, of course, there were Polish lands. There were just Austrian, Prussia, and Russia ruling over these Polish lands. So they knew clearly what it was like to actually have a colony, because their wealth was actually being extracted from them at the time. And it's in the same sense, I think Lenny Valerio made this argument clearly that despite the traumatic experience that these people went through, they quickly realized that part of the wealth to actually to develop a nation or to become a nation is the assumption that you have to have a colony, you have to rule over places where there are resources that could be tapped into. Interestingly, I mean, if really this thing was straightforward, like that thing that you said about the old domination of Poland by, we call them the free Eagles. I mean, the Polish people at the time who have actually learned quickly that, well, you know what, an attempt to have a colony will never work, because we know what we went through with Russia and Germany and all that. But the idea of having a colony is part of the process of actually having a wealth. And once this experience of being a nation is brought to the fore, then the question of how do we develop, where are the economic stuff going to come from? There are ways in which this thing could be negotiated. We're no longer under the influence of, as such, the influence of Germany or Russia anymore. We could, and I think also one way of them really trying to state that they are actually more powerful was to actually have a colony in order to recruit either people, either resources to be stronger. Population is power in many ways. And the reason also why Britain is very powerful, we mentioned this before, Britain is only just an island. And how is it possible that, the Queen of England is also Queen of Canada, is also Queen of Australia, is also Queen of, of many Commonwealth nations at the time? It was also because of this notion of the colony. And when the war broke out, everybody from the empire said, well, we have to go and fight for the mother country. It's in the same sense if we like, that we can actually think about attempt to have a colony by the colonial elite, that perhaps whenever we need any help, not only in terms of, wealth or money or all that, we will also get people to actually, to support us. And I have the feeling that in the 70s and 80s, when the alignment with all the socialist alignment with the African countries, that is also part of the whole notion that when they started voting in the League of Nations, many of these nations actually supported them. And until today, this is also part of the problematic thing with the war that's going on in Russia, that we found that many countries in Africa, they're actually sort of like supporting Russia. So this is some sort of a way of actually expanding or expanding your influence outside Central and Eastern Europe.
Thanks, Balaji. I
It's all right.
think we've come to a 2-hour limit. I'm sure people may want to speak to you afterwards, one-on-one, but thank you so much for coming and presenting to us.
Thanks a lot for having me.